Good afternoon, and welcome back to iCAAD Sessions. My name's Annie. I'm one of the liaisons with the speakers for London iCAAD. It's my great pleasure to introduce you to Nick Barton and Kirby Gregory. Kirby is a cognitive analytics psychotherapist and supervisor who's working in the addiction field since 1991. He was head of treatment at Cloud's House from 1999 until taking up the role of treatment director for Action on Addiction in 2007. And since 2015, he has worked as a consultant doing program design and supervision. Nick is qualified as a clinical psychologist and psychotherapist. He ran Cloud's House before going on to lead Cloud's Charity. From 2017 to 15, he was chief executive of Action on Addiction and was awarded an honorary doctorate of health by the University of Bath for services to addiction treatment. Today, their presentation is entitled The Healthy Container and will examine the concepts of containment and holding environments and exploring the difference between healthy and unhealthy containers and their implications for the patient and client. I'd like to thank you all for being here, and I'd like to thank you, Nick and Kirby, for touching on such an important subject. I'll turn it over to them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sound all right? Yep. Good. Well, welcome, and thank you all for coming. You had the introductions. My colleague Kirby. I would just like to pause and say I've probably learnt more about addiction and recovery from working with this man than from any other source. The title, is that all right?
Is that an admission of lack of knowledge?
Yeah. No, it's an admission of fawning relationships.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Doctor.
Here we have our title, The Healthy Container, and I put a copyright mark there because actually that's the title of the book I'm trying to write at the moment, which puts me in mind of the wonderful Private Eye cartoon where a man says to another man, "I'm writing a book," and his colleague says, "Neither am I." Anyway, the concept of the container is entirely relevant to the psychotherapeutic purpose in our view, and of course that will not be news to people, but we think the concept can and should be applied much more widely and probably much more consciously and deliberately to helping people recover from addiction, as in other contexts of treatment and care, for instance, but not limited to looked after children. Containers obviously come in various forms and guises, and the qualities of the container matter. It needs to be fit for purpose in every sense. The health and fitness of the professional container in whatever form we think is a key factor in the therapeutic relationship. And I don't know if any of you have been keeping up or get subscribed to Findings and the Effectiveness Review, because they've been doing a lot on the a review by the American Psychological Association into features of the therapist-client relationship and the ones that are particularly related to effectiveness. And if you haven't, then I advise you strongly to sign up to it because it makes very interesting and important reading. We're going to go on to discuss how a container may be unhealthy or healthy in relation to its purpose and how this may or may not influence ethical conduct. And we'll begin by reminding ourselves of the nature of the physical container and discuss how through its adoption as a metaphor, this came to form the basis of an important psychological construct which informed theories of parenting, child development, as well as theories of psychoanalytic psychotherapeutic practice. We will look at addiction treatment in this light and assess the role of the container in recovery-oriented therapies. And we will conclude by identifying how we think professional containers, and that's from individuals, teams, services, organizations, put themselves on course either to succeed or fail in this role. Just a quick check. Is everybody familiar with the concept of the container in the psychological field? Do say if you're not, it doesn't matter. Very good. One brave person says, I haven't got a clue. Anyway,
Can I just say
Yeah,
something about the ethical aspect? Because I was in Tim's excellent presentation, which those of you who were in that, it was about competence and the importance of people in the field knowing what they should be doing and having the skills to actually do it. And I wholeheartedly agree with that sentiment. But in a way, what we're talking about is at a level below that, which is, it doesn't matter how many competencies and skills you learn, if you're not in an environment that is containing and holding, you don't really stand a chance. So we're coming at it from that angle. Certainly, however contained and held you are, it's better that you know what you're doing as well. So I've been told. So I've been told.
Yeah. We like to combine our presentation with some interaction, and there isn't actually a flip chart, which is a bit disappointing, but we'll manage without. The two of us, as you've just heard, have spent a lot of our careers on the so-called clinical front line, but also in leading and managing organisations. And the most interesting question for us has always been and remains, how can we provide more effective help to the people who are coming to us in order to try to change? And before continuing, I have to give you, that's interesting, Jackson Pollock. Just the disclosure, so if you wouldn't mind taking a moment to read that. Means nothing dodgy is going on. Okay, shall we start with this? I want to know, we're going to confine ourselves at the moment just to physical entities. And what comes to mind in terms of a physical entity, a container, when you see this word? Just shout out anything. Tupperware. Interesting one. A dustbin. Sorry? A vessel. Which has many meanings. Yeah. A box. Anyone else? Space. A space. Excellent. Something with a boundary. So, what we're suggesting is that a container has structure. It has form and shape. You mentioned the word boundaries, and it's defined by that. It effectively has an inside and an outside. Our dustbin has an inside and an outside. Our Tupperware has an inside and an outside. And it stands on its own, or it may also be part of something else. A container obviously has a function, and obviously that is to contain. But it has other nuances of purpose, which I would like to, again, just ask you to shout out what you think those might be. And again, we're sticking here at the moment to the physical entities. So what possible functions might it be? Sorry?
To keep something in position.
To keep something in position.
Hold something.
To hold it. Storage. Order.
It creates a space between what is inside and what is outside. It creates a separation.
So it separates something off from something that's something else. Yep. A place of safety. Good. We came up with these.
Can I just ask a housekeeping issue? Are you comfortable with, instead of writing it down, taking photos of the slides?
You can take photos of the slide. Because we're not actually producing a copy of the slides, so you can take notes or photo it or whatever. So that's that. But we also came across to protect, hide, preserve, and constrain. Yes? All makes sense to you? You don't disagree with any of those, I would think. But not all containers are the same. They have qualities. They have degrees of quality of varying kinds. And again, let's think about what those might be. And anyone want to suggest? Flexibility, good. Strength,
Firm as well.
firmness, yes. Safety, degrees of safety, degrees of size, indeed. Transparency, yeah.
Structure.
So you can see into it or not see into it, structure and so on. So we came up with the capacity, the size of it, it has to have capacity, degrees of rigidity or solidity, the flexibility and adaptability, and also these. What about the last one, visibility? It might be invisible. What container might be invisible? We're not necessarily talking here about a physical container. Yeah. You're thinking about things like philosophies, ideologies, religions. Yeah, one might think of them as containers to a degree. All containers have something very important in common. This is so obvious, but needs stating. They are bigger than what they contain. Yeah? When we come later to talk about the therapeutic relationship, we're going to talk about the metaphorical implications of the word bigger, being bigger than what you contain, because that will have a meaning to it that we ought to explore. We're now going to move to discussion of the human container as a psychological construct. And that's because we can metaphorically contain others. We can interact in the way that we interact with them. We can use our brains, our minds, our personalities to do this. And it comes down in the end into the way that we are with them. Although the containing that we're speaking about is to some extent, as we've said, metaphorical, I don't think this should leave us in any doubt that the psychological container is not a very real phenomenon which can be very really experienced by human beings, one to the other. So although you might not immediately identify it in those terms as such, or at the time, we can feel contained or uncontained. What feelings might you experience if you felt uncontained? Chaos. Anxiety. Fear, anxiety. Sorry? Anxiety. Anger and anxiety come up a lot. Freedom. Freedom. Oh, if you've been constrained, you might experience freedom. It's an interesting point. But what else? What? Sorry? Dissociated. Interesting one.
Desperation.
You might feel also exposed, vulnerable, yeah, a bit threatened, possibly. You might feel all over the place. Fragmented. Indeed. Falling apart, we have a phrase. Sometimes these sort of common or garden phrases need to be just stopped and thought about, I think. So, yes, you might feel that. So if you're feeling contained, what might you feel? Safe. Secure. Heard. Very important part of containment, heard. Because what does that do to you? Yeah. Yeah, they've actually got you. Yeah.
Affirmed as an individual.
Affirmed. So there are lots of different feelings. So there's a big contrast for feeling uncontained and feeling contained.
I'm okay, you're okay.
Yeah, do you remember that? There was a great book, follow-up to I'm Okay, You're Okay, which was called I'm Okay, You're Not So Hot, which I always enjoyed. To help us with this subject, we need actually to consider briefly the contributions of these two people, who I'm sure you've heard of both, Containment Beyond and The Holding Environment by Donald Willicott. Wilfred be on. I mean, the psychoanalytic literature suggests that there are differences between them, and there are, but I think in some ways that the differences are too arcane to sort of get into in any great depth here. And I think for our purposes, it's much better to think of them as almost synonymous. They're certainly complementary and compatible. And the holding environment surely provides containment. And if it is containment you're after, then create a holding environment. And it's also worth mentioning the word reciprocity, because there was this was taken on a bit further, this thinking, to think of an exchange between the container and the contained, rather than just the container doing something with the contained. These concepts were developed by Bion and Winnicott to help illuminate the vital aspect of mother-infant relationship that contributes to fostering the healthy development of the child. Remember, the child emerges from a container, yeah? And it's really all that they've known sensorially rather than cognitively at this point. And containment and the holding environment, which is provided by the, self-contained mother, both physically and psychologically helps the child to cope with the feelings that emerge within it. These can often sometimes be alarming, confusing, distressing, and at worst completely overwhelming. And because a young child's feelings are experienced globally, that is, there's nothing else than what I'm feeling right now. The mother, the parent, is there to help it survive that feeling, and in the end to make sense of it. And that word, that phrase is terribly important throughout this, making sense. This can be achieved by the mother receiving, holding, and containing the feelings in a way and at a time that they can then be integrated by the child. And through this process, the child learns self-containment, which is the ultimate goal. What Bion and Winnicott both posited was that in terms of containment and the holding environment, what the mother does for the child, the therapist or the therapeutic service can, in a sense, do for the patient. And that we've had these words before, which is create a safe, a boundaried space in which to make sense of and integrate experience. And we all know that often addiction doesn't need to seem to make any sense whatsoever in one way. So what we're referring to here is the beginnings and the underpinnings of the therapeutic relationship. And it's interesting to me that when we talk about recovery, we talk in terms of personal growth and development, which seems to me to parallel very much the child development that we've just talked about. I always found it fascinating in the 12 steps that it's called steps. Yeah, it's a bit like you hold somebody's hand, you learn to walk, and then you let go of them. It's a very childlike image in some ways, and then you become autonomous and you go on your own. Of course, to be able to do this containing effectively, you have to possess certain qualities, in order to be able to be fit to perform the role. So we want to ask you, what comes to you, anything, when you see this image? Just anything you like. Love. Nurture. Presence. So just safety again. Yes, right. Tell me about presence. Is it both? Presence is the mother? Both. Okay. So there's a really there. Yes. Okay. Connection.
Connection. Yeah, they're occupying the same space.
The attunement with the feelings. So
Attuned to the feelings.
Yeah.
Yes.
it's not presence on the same level. It's sophisticated presence.
No, you got it. That's fine. I think that.
What is it about that image that suggests those things?
It's the embrace, I
Right, and what is it about the embrace? What does that suggest to you?
Comfort, yeah. She's leaning into the child's not leaning into her.
There's something about it, it doesn't look too tight, does it?
It looks like she's there for the needs of the child. Like the child doesn't look like he's worried about her so much.
Right. That's
There's also some bigger and some smaller.
Yes, it's a bigger person around it, and there's a beyond and an outside, and there's what's there between the two of them.
And it's not tight.
Exactly,
There's a gentle protection as well.
but it's not sort of, it's not suffocating. It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think I've used very much the word in running organisations about holding, and you can have far too tight, and you want to get free, yeah, or you can have smothery, let me out of here. I got to breathe, I got to get away, got to be free, or you can have, I don't give a shit, yeah, and you may end up in that case with Hogarth's famous print of Gin Lane. Can you see that? Yeah. But there's something else. Obviously, the central figure. I'm supposed to use the pointer. So I don't know if does it work?
yeah.
Yeah? I can't even see where it's doing. So. Huh? It did appear, did it? Anyway, if you look at the mother, yeah, that's what you focus on, isn't it? And the baby falling out of the arms because it's not safe, and she's preoccupied with something else, and she's not there, she's not present. She's there, but she's not present for the child. Yeah, but there's something more to this picture.
Which one?
Ah, good question. Choose. I'm talking about the one on the right.
But no, who's paying attention?
In the picture, the child.
Chaos. Uncontained.
What were you going to say?
In the first picture, the child takes up the most space, and the mother is in the background, although she's providing the child is more present in the picture, but the energy of the mother is more present than
Yeah.
in the feelings that the picture gives.
I think in what you've been talking about, particularly here, is a very important thing in all of therapeutic relationship. Yes. But it comes down in the end to how you are rather than what you do. Because how you are as a person or as an organisation will determine what you do and how you do it, the quality of your being. Get that right first, and then get on to the other stuff.
What about the mother and child thing? This responsibility comes in there, and that's it's not all because empathy, love, comfort. They're all really, really positive, aren't they? But responsibility has some weight.
Yes, yes.
So
Yeah.
it's complex. It's
Yes.
not.
No, that's a fantastically good point. And the opposite on the other side, completely irresponsible.
But it's also the context, because it's called Gin Lane. They're all at it. It's it's a collection of people doing stuff that causes the neglect. Well, I mean, we know that happens with addiction, don't we? I mean, addiction has a culture. And if you're in that culture, it's harder to pay attention to being responsible.
What I find also interesting about that picture is I think it was you used the word fragmentation. That's terribly fragmented, isn't it? Things are falling apart, breaking down. It's just not a safe environment at all, is it?
It also strikes me as a simplicity of the first simplicity of that moment and the
very good
Yeah.
spot. Yeah. When we first chose this one, or actually it was chosen by my wife, we spent quite a long time seeing more and more and more, and thinking that means something too. Coming in both pictures, even though this is much more simple and straightforward in some ways, you know, the quality of the holding and the holding environment and the containment is just about right.
There is something, I remember when we first had this discussion, though. Are you familiar with John Berger, a book by John Berger called Ways of Seeing? And I think there's a way, I think it's interesting that a room full of, you know, compassionate, therapy-minded people look at that and they see love and gentleness and care. Somebody could look at that from a perspective of, that reminds me of when I was constrained, and you know, and thinking about containers. You know, someone said about freedom. I mean, the slides at the beginning about the nature and the purpose of containers. If you're in prison, that container is not going to feel safe and nurturing and comforting, is it? And sure, you will get a sense of freedom when you leave, but also you'll have a sense of vulnerability. And I think the other thing that was on the slide that came to mind was the idea that containers sometimes can preserve things. You know, you put something in a jar so it remains edible. If you're running a treatment service, you have to be careful that you're not preserving the very thing that you're trying to treat. Well, we're going to come on to that, aren't we? Sorry, I jumped the gun then.
You always do. You get the idea we're a bit rude to each other, but it doesn't matter. Okay, we're going to come back to this image, or these images. The container, as a concept, it's relevant to individuals, individual practitioners, to teams, to services, to organisations. Of course, it's also relevant to individuals and families, communities and societies, but we're going to stick, otherwise we spend forever, but we're going to stick on the left-hand side of this slide. And here's another representation of that. I'm afraid my computer skills didn't allow me to put in teams above practitioner and before service, but you get the point. And we were trying to decide, does this look like a cone or a funnel? Maybe both. Yeah. The thing is that this also gives you some idea of an environment, and there's also a context which we haven't identified, the world around it, which is going to have a bearing on what goes on in it. I still remember well, it was a very, very long time ago when community care came in, and we'd been operating as a treatment centre very quietly on our own, thank you very much, and suddenly in comes the state and throws everything up in the air, and it was quite a change. So you have to think about what's going on in the world outside as well that might be affecting what goes on in the containers. And here we've got container, they're all containers. The patient's containing, the practitioner's containing their own stuff, the service is containing stuff individually and together, and the organisation. And they all, in a way, as we will talk about, work together, and you have to be careful of disconnection.
Question, is
Yes.
the patient's immediate world in the circle of the patient? You know, it's because every person has their own world that might actually technically, for them, be between themselves and the practitioner. Where is that space? Is it still in their circle?
Well, it is between them. It is in the space between them. Yes? And so much goes on, doesn't it, in the space between practitioner and patient. But what we're also saying is don't forget the wider context, because there's actually a relationship going on with the organisation through the practitioner with the patient. Yeah? That sometimes gets forgotten about. Do you want to say?
Well, at the risk of jumping the gun again, the relationship between the organisation and the patient may not be through the practitioner. You know, organisations can create cultures or physical spaces that maybe work against the practitioner. I mean, I've certainly worked in treatment centres where they were very, you know, grand places, but the places where you had to do counselling were like broom cupboards. So although the patient and the practitioner have this relationship, there's something outside of that that is having a direct influence. And that raises a lot of questions about, well, why would that happen? And Nick's going to tell you in a minute.
But you raise an important point, which is the buildings, the physical environment is important. And for a long time, particularly I think because of the stigma of addiction, it was seemed okay to not give people very nice environments in which to try to recover, which seemed to me to be entirely the wrong approach. People who are feeling so miserable about themselves and such low self-esteem, give them something really nice that feeds back to them they're okay. So yes, let's think about both the rooms, the buildings, and also the wider context. Now, why is this all this, or is it, or why do we think it's relevant at all to be discussing the containment, the container, and the holding environment, and so on? What do you think of that statement? Addiction is a container. You're relying on it for?
To help regulate it in some way.
So it's a regulator. Yeah.
Your substance of choice is the only thing that listens to you and makes you feel better.
Okay.
That fact kind of
So in a way it's a container, and it takes care of your feelings to a degree.
Keeps others out.
Very good. Yes. Isolates, separates you off. Yeah. Disconnects you.
It's the embrace, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like the picture, the addiction is the embrace. That's what makes you feel. That's what I found personal experience. When I first used a substance, I really
Yeah.
the child, I was going to say, with heroin, as that child looked was other examples.
It was an interesting phrase you popped in there. When I first used. Yeah?
Absolutely, yeah.
It's the wonderful promise. I once did a talk to, of all things, the College of Bishops. They're all dressed, as they put it, in mufti, looking very much like you lot. And they suddenly reduced my talk that I was going to give from 20 minutes or something down to 5, just like that, out of the blue. Thank you, Your Grace. And I said, listen, I'm going to leave you with one message, and this one will suit you. If you want to cast the devil in the movie, just go to addiction. That'll do it. You know, it's the seductive friend who takes your soul. And that was about it. That was about the extent of my talk. Seemed to go down quite well.
What's interesting is addiction works as both, doesn't it?
It works as both.
Both.
Yeah,
Both the container as well as creating the chaos.
very good.
So
you jumping the gun? Or?
Well, the important thing about what you said about at the beginning, it feels like that embrace. And I think for a lot of people, that is doubly powerful if you haven't really had the experience of the embrace in the first place. And, you know, we know that a lot of people that we come across with addiction have that kind of deficit. The journey from there to the chaos.
They're also over-contained. Some people with addiction are over-contained.
Yeah. True. True.
You can have an experience of being restricted. Addiction develops as a result of
Trying to get out.
trying to get out.
Yeah, yeah. An escape.
The embrace,
Yeah.
as the gentleman said, he looks at the embrace and creates some chaos.
It's an
Very
important point.
So, in a way, one of the things that makes addiction so powerful, it can be everything that we want it to be at the beginning. It can promise us whatever it is we're looking for.
But what kind of container is it? I'm selling my painting of the pressure cooker. I couldn't find one that I really liked, so I was given to painting one myself. I think in a way it's this double-sided thing that somebody suggested, that it's a great container, but it isn't. Now, I think there's a point to that, which is, did you ever see the film Trains, Planes and Automobiles? There's a wonderful scene where John Candy and Steve Martin are driving along blithely, and they're on the motorway or something, and a car is going, shouts across the window, "You're going the wrong way," because they're driving on the wrong side of the road. And I just thought, that's kind of what addiction, in a way, keeps signaling with all this chaos and the symptoms and the rest. You're going the wrong way. There's another way. But maybe you couldn't get there without going through this first. And I think, I've often said that I think addiction actually results from an attempt to get well by the wrong route. But that it also keeps showing you it doesn't work that way. Try something different. And that point, you always have that point of offer where you can change.
I've just been thinking about the point that you made just now about over-constraint. And what kind of family environment can give you that experience? A family that is in the grip of addiction. If you grow up in a family that is got addiction in it, you will receive all those messages about you've got to keep it in the container. You don't talk about what goes on in the family outside. And if you do, there'll be terrible consequences. So it's putting responsibility on the child to keep that secret.
We even have a phrase, keep a lid on it.
Yeah. Do people know what pressure cookers are? Because I think they're a thing from the 1950s, aren't they?
Thank you.
Do they still have pressure cookers? Yeah? Oh, good.
May I just point out at this point, you suggested a pressure cooker.
It's a metaphor, yes, I know.
Anyway, once the lid comes off, what's exposed? Lots of the dynamic content is exposed, lots of the feelings of dysfunction, conflict, anxiety, hurt, pain, grief, it's all there, isn't it? Leaking like crazy, pressing the lid off the pressure cooker, but it's there. So let's say you've got all of that, the lids come off, and you're in a treatment centre with 30 people, and it's all happening at the same time. That's a kind of recipe, isn't it? OB, you must have experienced that. So you've got all these different people from different backgrounds, whatever, and they're all starting to take the lid off and expose. And some of it's still unconscious and projected into the container that's receiving it, and some of it's beginning to become even more conscious, and it can be quite unsettling. So I think what we're talking about in terms of the therapists and the treatment services and so on is a transitional container. Yeah? So we're saying pour it into here for a bit, we'll be bigger than you, effectively, and we'll take it on board and help you make sense of it and help you get it back and then integrate it. I was thinking this morning, actually, when I was putting this suit on, I was hoping it was bigger than me. It was going to contain me. It seems to have done all right. So that's the idea, is this transitional container. And that's also where we think, Kirby alluded to Tim's talk earlier, is where we think also the role of supervision comes in. Because you're trying to do all this containing of all this stuff that's now coming up and is available to everybody. And you're trying to do that. And one thing we know about addiction and all these strength and powerful feelings is that it disrupts the ability to think. And the ability to think clearly in the interests of the people that you're trying to help. it disrupts it. You'll find yourself going, oh, we're in a complete fog. Yes.
Yeah, I was just going to say that when I've seen supervisors, it's always felt like I've gone and deposited with me iCAAD. So that's a
great.
safe place, go and then come back.
Yeah.
So it helps you function.
Yeah. Helps you think it through, doesn't it? Yeah. The addiction, if receiving all this, will try to take over the container. Do you think? Why?
Because it's like a form of control, isn't it? You want to be controlled.
There's a sort of imperative to it to survive. I often think of it as again, metaphorically, as it's not, I don't think, a virus. So, which has an imperative to survive and thrive, yeah, and pass on. And in a way, we've talked about recovery contagion. You know, people who are around other people who recover tend to then maybe find the impetus to recover themselves. Why isn't it the same also with addiction? That if you have enough addiction around, it will affect other people, and they will catch it too, in a sense. So, stopped. Like many things, it's not responding.
All like this.
No, that's,
Like an addict doesn't like being told what to do.
thank you. Oh, okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So just to make the point again, that every container that's involved in it is going to be affected by what it's asked to contain, and sometimes that can be quite threatening. We've talked about it. What it is to try to make a safe space for the person or the thing that or the person that you're going to try to contain. Reminding us ourselves again that each one has to be bigger. Now, I said that we'd come to bigger as a metaphor. What do we mean by bigger? And
Able to deal with what's
able to deal with. What makes you able to deal with it?
That you've got a resource, you've got an answer or something to offer
Right.
to help.
Just go resource. What do you mean resource?
Like an awareness of what's happening with that person.
Right.
You know, so that if you have an awareness of what's going on for that person, you can offer like the knowledge so that person will then feel known, and then that's a containment of them. Whereas if you don't know, then you're going to feel loose and scared and in that ambiguous place again.
So you may have a level of knowledge or understanding that they may not have access to at the moment.
Yeah, well, I suppose that sometimes you're a bit blinkered by what's going on for you.
We're talking about the patient or the therapist?
Everyone, I
Yeah.
suppose.
Yeah.
It does work on each of those levels.
Going back to the first picture, is the addict the question? Is it? It's not. There's parts of the addict that are not fully adult, or is going back to the place where the containment didn't happen in the right way. So then, to answer the second question, then maybe that process has happened. There is a security within the temporary container that has not previously been experienced
before.
before.
Okay.
It's felt secure.
Yeah. So you're giving them something that they may never have experienced before, which they might do what with?
I don't really get attached to it or sabotage it.
Yeah. Right. It might be quite unsettling in some ways. So sabotage would be one option. Not always, not guaranteed, of course.
Well, yeah, I think that's important because if you're helping people to develop so that they can become self-contained, that has to be made explicit. It has to be in the therapeutic relationship. It has to be talked about and understood. Otherwise, there's a danger of creating dependence. And you know what Nick was saying about how addiction can kind of creep its way in. That's one way it can creep in. You know, practitioners can get some self-soothing out of patients being dependent. And unfortunately, I've come across that quite a lot in this field. You know, it's like, my patients love me, so I must be good. But they're going to leave in 3 weeks, and they'll be bereft. So it's, you know, I think this, the thing about the kind of holding is that it's not constraining someone's ability to grow. It's just matching to where they are, to the stage that they're at. And I mean, in the competences, that was one of the important things about recognising what stage people are at and delivering something that's appropriate to that.
There is trust though, because going back to those 2 pictures, if you took that baby on the right that's just flying off the railings and it got better and you picked it up and said, I'm now going to give you to this lady here, there would be a fear. How does that baby know that that
Yeah.
lady's not going to throw him off the railings, you know,
Yeah.
again? Is that
Well, you mentioned an incredibly important word.
There we go.
Because anxiety had been mentioned before, when, you know, what's it feel like when you're not it's safely contained? It, you know, you can feel very anxious.
You can't grow if you're in fear, can you? So much you inspire to know.
Yeah.
So you've got to feel safe in order to start going a bit deeper then, because you feel your concentration and your focus can turn a bit harder.
So that question you posed, you know, how would you, if you felt anxious, are you going to trust this new thing that you don't know anything about, or are you going to trust the thing that actually promised you a lot of stuff and maybe you just didn't try hard enough? You know, so you could go back and you could work it again and see if that works. I mean, that's what people do in addiction. They go back and they see if they can make it work better. So
because trust is physical, you know, from what I've heard in other sessions, you know, from what I've read, is that we are biologically programmed to distrust once had a negative experience of being thrown off the railings. So not only are you convincing your mind, but on a body level, it's saying, no, this is not going to work. You're going to be on the floor again. So that's really
that's true,
hard.
but I mean, what Nick alluded to earlier was often in a treatment setting, you're with a group of other people, some of whom are further on in their recovery, and some of whom can say to you, you know what, I've put my trust in these people, and I think it's a risk worth taking.
What makes the service or the practitioner trustworthy?
Integrity.
Consistency, yes?
Congruence.
Congruence, yes.
Sound boundaries.
Indeed, they keep boundaries. The basic thing, though, is they know what they are doing. Yeah? Now, some psychologists said we don't want a parent or a therapist or whatever knowing too militantly that they think they know what they're doing. But they have an expertise and a knowledge and a competence and a confidence to be able that they actually do know what they're doing. Yeah? Now, some people will try to fool you that they know what they're doing when they don't. But other people, you can really pick it up, can't you? That they know what they're they know what they're talking about. They know what they're doing. That gives you a basic safety. That makes them something that you can allow to be bigger for a moment than you. Yeah. So you better have a good understanding that you know what you're doing.
Yeah, but also, you have to have the ability to recognise when you come up against, I don't know what to do here.
Yeah, because it's very important that you are honest with yourself. Yeah, you know your limitations. You're prepared to examine those honestly and do something about them, which, you know, rather than just skating over the top and carrying on like you've always done, because that's the way you do things.
If your practice is safely contained, it's okay to not know what you're doing because there's a
Nobody
container
knows
that
it.
will know what you're doing, hopefully.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So also in anxiety, we alluded to some of the things possibly that what people do when there's anxiety about. What do organisations and services do when there's anxiety about?
Close ranks.
Close ranks is one thing. It's a long list. Yeah, people do stuff. Yeah, do lots of stuff. Keep busy. You know, it'll keep whatever the real issue is. That.
Around like endless chicken.
Yeah, exactly. Don't, avoid completely. Yes. Blame is one. I love blame. Such a good. Sorry, that's my wife. Blame is a wonderful thing, isn't it? Yeah? Somebody else. So all of the amazing. You can write. You probably come up with them yourself. A long list of potential institutional offences, and it's a good sometimes to have a checklist. Is that what's going on around here? Are we avoiding the discomfort? Are we facing up to things? Are we dealing with our anxiety by denying what's going on? Pretending it isn't? Smoothing over? Endless. Yeah? You have to, that does not make it safe, does not make you a trustworthy container for the people who are going to leave things with you where they want to be able to trust you implicitly. And we've talked about the past. Don't forget that a lot of these people, a lot of us, have been let down, betrayed, hurt. Yeah? We've put our trust in things. I mean, I sometimes say that a parent is a promise. A parent is an evolutionary promise that I will get my needs fulfilled. Isn't it? Otherwise, what are they there for? Right? And that gets abused or neglected or doesn't happen in whatever way. So lots of people that actually come with that basic distrust, and we've had this thing, how can you help them to trust, because that's going to be when they start handing over and showing things that they won't otherwise show, perhaps never before have done so.
So I think it's really important to acknowledge that trust is given. It's a decision that a person makes to trust you.
There's an elephant in this room, which is the risk. Isn't that why you wanted me to draw an elephant? This is also for sale.
I thought it was a mammoth.
It's something wrong with his legs. They're shorter than that.
I know, it's terrible.
Sorry.
That's what addiction does to you.
Sorry, this is the art class. So, trustworthy. I just want to emphasise trustworthiness comes down to you know what you're doing, you're prepared to look at your limitations, you're honest with yourself and other people that you work with. You know, the cover-up is always the greater problem, isn't it, in the end? So don't cover it up. The other thing we should mention about being bigger, there is also an elephant, there's a risk, big, elephant, there's a risk in being bigger. What is it? Power. Absolutely so. What happens to power? Gets misused. And if you're in that position, you better be aware of that and aware in you how you might misuse the power that you have. Somebody I was talking to said, you only really find out who you are when you've got power. Which is, I thought, quite an interesting observation.
Trust to me is not automatic. Trust needs to be earned. So you can't automatically assume as a person within those circles that the patient is going to trust those.
No.
So
exactly so. That is exactly what we're trying to get across, is that, it's creating that environment, the holding, the containing environment, and doing so in a way that enables somebody to trust you, often with incredible, sometimes they say, I never told anybody this before. Yeah? They may have, but you don't know. But that's quite a powerful statement.
But if you're...
Maybe withhold information.
Very likely, and wouldn't you?
Yeah.
I would. I might want to check it out first. I might want to throw a few tests to see how it goes down and how they respond and react. Are they going to let me down like everyone else has? Yeah? And also, sorry, you were going to say?
Well, I was thinking that's really kind of very clear when you think about the risk that patients take in trusting counsellors, therapists. But it's just as important that if you're a therapist working in a service, that you can trust the organisation. And there are, in a way, that the what you were saying about, from a patient's point of view, they need to see trustworthiness demonstrated. Well, so do the people who work in a service. They need to see an organisation understanding and dealing with the challenges. And what Tim was saying in his presentation was that as a field, the idea of competences it doesn't demonstrate for therapists and practitioners much trust, does it? Here's a really important aspect that is not being taken seriously. If you want, if you don't feel that you're being taken seriously, it's very hard to trust.
I think also people fall into addiction because they're self-medicating a mental health issue that is not being picked up by the services that should be helping them.
Well, I would say that
The mental health services have a long way to go to be reputable and trustworthy.
But the word competence means I know what I'm doing. I am competent. Yeah.
And the mental health services openly admit they don't treat addiction. Well, what does that mean?
Because they're anxious. Because they're anxious about it, in the same way that addiction services often didn't want to have anything to do with mental health, because they felt anxious about it and incompetent. Yeah? So they were worried they were going to make a big mistake. Healthy and unhealthy containers, in the end, comes down to a tale of two cultures. And the two cultures I'm talking about, or we're talking about, are the culture of addiction and the culture of recovery. And they have, their facets, their attributes, which we were going to have a little exercise where we scribbled on a flip chart, but there's no flip chart, where we could talk about what are the contrasting values from addiction and recovery. I think we've covered a lot of them in the conversation that we've been having. But one scientific definition of culture says a culture is conditions suitable for growth. And the question for us is that the growth of addiction or the growth of recovery? Is this culture that we're operating in, is it encouraging kind of addiction values? Let's say dishonesty, avoidance, quick fixes, shortcuts, all those things, or is it actually encouraging, the kind of things that we know underpin a good recovery? And that's something that every provider should be asking themselves. Recovery culture, I think, has to be worked at all the time. Addiction culture, you can just let it happen. Yeah, it's more by neglect, indifference, inattention, complacency. all of those kind of things. So you have to be prepared to work.
But
Sorry, how do you work on that in relation to the kind of context that we're in, which is like a kind of quick fix, nice guideline, Lord Layard type responses?
Yeah.
Because it doesn't facilitate that. And if, as probably many of us are, work in private practice where we have insurance companies who just quote you the nice guidelines or quote you, the limitations of the funding in a way. I don't know how you fight that back, because basically you're talking about having a relationship which sustains growth, and it takes time.
you've got to be offering something that extends beyond the intervention or the treatment that you are providing.
But a lot of insurance companies are very limited to,
Yeah, I don't necessarily mean in physical terms. I mean in psychological terms, in the work that you're doing with the patient. The whole idea of self-containment and self-empowerment is that when that person leaves and goes on, they can carry something with them. I mean, there's a tale of two cultures. Have you had the experience, any of you had the experience of it being in a treatment service where everything is nice? And as a team, you might be saying, what the hell's going on? People aren't doing anything. They're just being really nice. So you call a community group and you say to people, what's going on here? And they go, why are you trying to spoil it? We're all really getting on well. We're all fine. If it wasn't for you lot, we'd be great. And what does that remind you of? That's how families attempt to deal with addiction. So, in a way, the answer to your question is you've got to help people to recognise when they are part of that process. Where they, Gin Lane, if you wouldn't necessarily come across Gin Lane by accident, you'd make your way there because you knew what was going on. And that's what addiction does. You know where it is. People in recovery know exactly how to get back to addiction if they want to. So you have to be able to recognise the culture. And that's not always easy when you've been stuck in that pressure cooker. Let's get the pressure cooker back in again.
Is Gin Lane a choice?
Mm-hmm.
Are you saying that Gin Lane is a choice that people make?
Yeah.
Or is it a road they don't really want to go on and they just stumble?
Well, they may stumble on it, but they make a choice whether to stick around or not. I mean,
Addiction is a choice. Because most addicts would,
I tell you what,
I've met would say they don't want to be there.
I have never met in all the years I've worked in the field anyone who chose to be an addict.
Exactly.
I have met lots of people who chose to change the way they feel or experience life or whatever by taking something that changes the way they feel. And maybe in that process they develop a relationship which maybe becomes a consuming relationship and they become addicted. There's a very interesting book which I looked at recently, which is Nick Heather's book on choice, Addiction and Choice. It's well worth reading. And people have different views as to whether it is or isn't. I have not actually met someone, what I want to do with my life? I want to become an addict. I don't think you hear that. Probably it's, go to the careers office and...
Cobain said it. He did.
He did he?
Yeah.
Thank you.
He wanted to be the world's best junkie. He did.
All right.
If you're
So
born
I'm
in
wrong.
Brick Lane,
Pardon?
if you're born in Gin Lane,
I never met him.
I've lost my mind, sorry, it's been a long day.
Yeah.
If you're born in Gin Lane, it feels like home, so sometimes there's comfort even in discomfort.
Yes, social context is incredibly important. As you say, it may be all you've known. And years ago when we were doing a lot of work with families and the children's family, that was all I knew. So yes.
What are the merits, going back to the trust and anxiety, which in my own personal life, they've never been, oh, I've handed over the trust and then got rid of the anxiety. I might have handed over trust on Tuesday, and by Tuesday night I'm climbing the walls, wishing I had not. And then on Wednesday I'm very distrustful. And so it's one day at a time. And then what are the merits of honesty in these short-term solutions of when somebody's at a good enough place to hear, you know, what is the position on that of saying, you know, you are here for X amount of time, it's not going to, you know, but it's going to get you to this next stage. I don't know, is that something that happens, or does one, you know, that ending, you know, that this big thing in therapy, and the endings come quicker in treatment centres than they do in individual therapy, and endings are big things for people in general, and for addicts even more, particularly if one's handed over that trust. So do you manage the ending in the beginning, or is it?
Well, I think endings are always more powerful if they're not talked about, if they're not understood. So I think the idea of not mentioning the ending until it comes is not a good strategy. Because in a way, I think that, you know, trust and anxiety, you can see that anxiety is the price that you have to pay in order to trust. You can't trust and be free of anxiety. I mean, we all have to do that every day, every minute of our lives, don't we? We make decisions where we make a decision, we're going to trust something, and we might feel anxious about it. But I mean, I parked my car on a parking meter down there, and it said it was free on bank holiday for 2 hours. Now, and I walked away, and I thought, yeah, it's free, you don't have to pay, but is that only for 2 hours? But I'm willing to tolerate that anxiety. So.
Endings, so do you talk about endings when people are
I think that you have to name the ending at the beginning. Whatever setting you're in, I mean, if you're a therapist doing individual therapy, unless you're doing an open-ended therapy where you say, well, we'll know when it's time to leave, and I would say, you know, there's some pitfalls in that approach. But generally, if you're providing therapy, I mean, what you might say is, you agree we're going to have 10 sessions, or you agree you're going to be here for 3 weeks. Well, you know, the next day you say, well, we're going to be here for 2 weeks and 6 days. You count it down so that, because if people are anxious about the ending, it's better that they experience and are able to talk about that anxiety before it gets to you're leaving tomorrow.
That is the container, isn't it?
That is the container. And it's something that, it's not all about making it nice. You know, it's about helping people face up to something that's painful.
Yeah, and it's not giving false expectation.
Sorry, I can't hear very well. Did you hear that?
Secondary benefits.
Secondary benefits.
Of what? So, yes, I think we probably call it secondary gain. Is that right? Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's okay. I just wanted to make sure I understood what you were saying.
Like this concept in the container, you have to deal with, like for example,
Well, certainly, I mean, the kind of therapy that I trained in as a psychotherapist was cognitive analytic therapy, where the therapy was always a set number of sessions. So the standard thing was 16 sessions. I mean, interestingly enough, as a sideline, I trained at Guy's Hospital, but I was working at Cloud's House at the time, and my supervisor at Guy's said, we don't want you to see any patients at Cloud's. because they'll all be addicts. We want you to see all your patients in the Monroe Clinic in Bermondsey. So I did 4 years there, and 95% of the people I saw were addicts. And it's interesting that they didn't have anywhere to go. Actually, it started a flow of people into treatment. But going back to the question, the idea that you, in those 16 sessions, you and the patient both know that's how long it's going to be. All of the issues that come up about the ending, and they're all going to be connected with past losses, past inabilities to deal with disappointment, etc., etc. A question I would, a question I would ask people at the beginning was, knowing what you know about yourself, if you were going to sabotage this therapy to avoid the ending, how would you do it? And they would answer straight away, oh, I'd do this. So immediately we had some understanding, shared understanding, that the ending was presented a real challenge and it had to be kept on the table. Now, beyond that, I mean, certainly in the CAT world, what happens is that you have a 1 month follow-up, then a 3 month follow-up, and then a 6 month follow-up. That's not to re-engage in the therapy, it's to help people recognise how they've dealt with the ending. What did they do in that month after the therapy? What were the issues? What other support did they need to find? Because the NHS has got limited resources and you can't just keep giving people, well, I mean, most service providers are like that. They have a limit to what they can provide. So the idea that you're trying to enable people to be able to contain themselves enough, that's the major aim, I think, of any therapeutic intervention. Thanks. Stunned into silence. Go on.
When I was running a treatment centre, we found ourselves, a team, feeling at one point like the boat was rocking and we were kind of feeling like a bit anxious and what the hell's going on? I can't make sense of this. And I went to a wise cousin of mine and I said, this is what's going on. Do you know anyone we can talk to? Because we just thought there's something we're not getting to grips with. And she said, I know just the person. And it was somebody who had a background in at the Institute of Marital Relations, of all things. But she was an ex-social worker, nurse, family therapist, and I went to see her and I said, her name is Evelyn Cleverley. Do you know the name?
She was at the Tavistock.
She was at the Tavistock, yeah. And I went to see her and I said, Evelyn, I've been recommended to you. I need you to come and help us think. Incredibly quiet, modest person. Of course, I realized that if you're going to hear things, it kind of helps to keep quiet. She had a stillness about her, still does. And I said, come and help us think. Come and help me and the team think, because we're rocking. And she used to get in her modest little car and drive all the way down the M3 and spend a couple of hours with us and the team. And I think one of the things that really lodged first with me was what she said is, you do realise what you're dealing with here, don't you? No, she said, you are dealing with addiction. Oh yeah. And that is being reflected in the service and in the organisation in some way, and you're caught up in it. And once we recognised that, and with her help, we started to get bigger than addiction. Rather than it taking over us and so on in its subtle, undermining ways, we got our thinking back. Do you remember I said it disrupts you? Yeah, you're nodding. Disrupts your thinking if you're not careful. And that's what I said to her. And I hadn't even thought about it before, but I said, I need you to help us think. And boy, did she help us think. And she came for quite a long time, once a month. And she had wonderful phrases such as, I think it's time to fasten your seatbelts. Because she knew we were going to go through this for a bit.
And there was an implicit message in that, which was, you can deal with this. It will be a bit rocky, but you can deal with it. And you know, often that's what we're saying to our patients. We don't have the answer. We just say, this is something that you will find an answer to.
But I've used several times so far in this talk, we have, the phrase to make sense. And alluded to the fact that so often addiction and what comes with it doesn't seem to make sense, and it confuses and disrupts and gets our heads spinning. And so having that moment to stop and think and to make sense of what was going on, particularly in terms of the dynamics of addiction being reflected in the organisation. But I don't think it happens just within organisations dealing with addiction. I mean, I went to help an organisation dealing with eating disorders. And I heard myself say to them, why are you starving yourself of resources? Yeah? So it gets reflected in some way, and you need to ask the question, and we've done this with other organizations, is where is addiction here? You know, where is it? How is it? Is it quiet somewhere underneath, or is it loud in the corner? Where is it? Let's at least look and be aware of that possibility. So Evelyn's contribution has been, certainly to me personally and professionally, was just enormous, which is
infuriating.
Yeah.
I remember complaining to her about somebody I was trying to manage unsuccessfully. And she said to me, what purpose do you think he's serving? And you know, it was after that I thought, yes, he's right. This person is a thorn in my side, but it's serving a purpose. You know, it's making me think about something.
How powerful addiction is, isn't it? Like, you know, when you're talking about that powerlessness and you're thinking, oh, well, you know, you can just make a choice, but in a way, part of the powerlessness is that you can't make the choice because you're in it and it's clogged. It's like an invisible curtain surrounding you and you can't see through it. So it's powerful, isn't it?
which is so nice just to fix it. And then you think, well, that's addiction, isn't it? Just fix it rather than work it through. The other thing just about healthy and unhealthy containers, we used to have at Cloud's House a thing called a reunion every year, and 500 odd people would turn up. And I used to get kind of face ache from smiling at people who were in recovery. One day I was talking to a guy who was leaning on a tree, I think, and I said to him, oh, hello, and I introduced myself. How are you? You know. And he said, I'm fine, I'm just kind of taking it all in. And I said, tell me your story. And he said, well, I've never been anywhere, and I've been to several treatments, and I've also worked as a nurse, where the patient has been treated with such care, dignity, and respect. And I said, you know, I'm really pleased to hear that. But what really intrigues me is, how did that help? And he said, I'll tell you, it meant we didn't have to think about you guys. All right? In other words, we felt safe. We could get on with the difficult things we needed to do because we felt you guys could be trusted. Yeah. So he probably tested us at some point, as people will do. Can you be trusted? So on. And there's this struggle all the time going on between addiction and recovery, where addiction is trying to take over and undermine and consume and infect and infiltrate in all sorts of ways. And that's why, you know, sticking together and being aware of that and reminding yourselves to think about that is incredibly important. Yes, but trusting themselves is obviously ultimately the critical thing, and also that way they can develop and become self-contained rather than relying on somebody else to provide that for them. But coming back to the transitions and the preparing for the ends, which is so important, because these are short episodes against a life. Yeah. It giving the message, the positive message of people being able to do it.
Do you think we know that an isolated incident can cause a lifetime of mistrust? How powerful are isolated incidents of profound trust? Do they carry the same weight?
That's a fantastic question, and a scientific study I die to see. I can't answer it honestly. I don't know, but I think you have to refer to yourself and think, have there been moments of really profound trust where I let go? I was always struck by one person said to me, when I was contemplating recovery, I didn't know what was on the other side. It was a bit like a bungee jump. I didn't know if I jumped into recovery, let go of all that was behind me in addiction, that I would be okay. But something in me knew that's what I had to do, and off I went. Now, I reckon it helps if you've got somebody catching, receiving, ready, understands what you're going through and why that is such an important step for you to take. But I think it demands research, your question. Get onto King's College straight away and ask them. Do you want to add anything?
It's very profound.
That's step 3, isn't it? That moment.
Is it?
Yeah, like making decisions, turning your will and your life over to the care of God, as you understand it. You don't know, or you've just got to trust that if you do, it'll be okay, because something is taking care of everything. So you just have to get on with the business of doing the work. So be contained by that faith.
It's a funny thing, trust. It's one's very powerful and affecting, and also very fragile, isn't it? I mean, I think what you alluded, it can just go like that. But if it's sustained and if it works, it's so powerful and allows people to do so much. So, and
it's like motivation. I mean, the idea that people make a choice to be in recovery and they're motivated for it, the idea that they'll feel just as motivated the next day is not guaranteed. Yeah, exactly. But part of dealing with the lack of motivation is part of the development.
And the reason why you have to provide that container, though, is because you need to provide the evidence that the faith isn't baseless. Do you know what I mean? Otherwise, it's just a...
I'm sorry I realise that I've been bloody awful timekeeping again. Anyway, here's the quality here, and my elephant's back, by the way. My stumpy little elephant. It's the art critics in the back row. But the big elephant in this room is us and what we bring to the role of the container. What's in it for us? I think reciprocity is a good thing. Otherwise, we wouldn't do it. If we didn't get something out of it, we wouldn't do it. But the question is, what do we get out of it, and how much, and to what end? So it does matter to think about that. And that, again, I think, is where the importance of supervision is so incredibly important, that you've got somebody with an informed independence of mind to some extent who's able to help you go through that, because you will get dragged into things. I remember when I first mentioned the phrase counter-transference at Cloud's house, probably in primordial times. And what? It just didn't make sense to anybody. I think it does much more now, but it's what the patient will bring up in you that then invites you to behave in a way that is most unhelpful to them. And what they're probably doing is inviting you to take up a historic role. to play out the same thing. Now that's, on one way, wonderful, accessible information right there for you to work with. If you miss it because you're not aware of the process, you are going to get into serious, and you're going to do things that are unhelpful, if not harmful. So you have to be aware of what the patients or patient are bringing up in you, either as an individual, or as a team, or service, or whatever.
But you have to be aware of your own issues. Because if you're a person, if you become a therapist and you're a person who can't say no, who always wants to please people, you're not going to be able to enter into a therapeutic relationship that's healthy. You'll just get used up.
But don't you think that it's, you know, it's really, if you're, these are the advantages and disadvantages of working in groups. If you've got a great team, you can work together, you can point stuff out, you know, that you know, things with each other, co-supervise each other, can't you? But you're not just getting, it's unlike a one-to-one relationship with the clients. You won't just be getting, you won't just be having, you know, the transfers and counter transfers with one person at a time. You might be getting them from all over the place. So, you know, it is complex, but that's partly what makes it exciting as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a different approach in the sense that if you're working in a group, you're trying to facilitate the transference between the patients so that they can understand it. You don't have to necessarily be in there.
No, but if you're working in rehab and you're not just have one role, do you? You don't have an isolated role, you're being lots of different people at lots of different times.
Yeah.
And situations you might be teacher one minute, you might be therapist,
Yeah,
maybe
yeah.
groups. I'll check that.
Yeah, sorry. But I mean, I well remember a classic example of that is walking around and somebody saying, "Hello, Governor." Oh, well, wait a minute, hang on, stop right there. I'm not a governor. Where did that person come from? Prison. And they brought that mindset into this context because they knew how to operate within that thing. But you could go all funny about that, or you could say, that's interesting. That's something we can work with. So we start working with it, find a different way. So, as I say, I think not having some kind of supervision arrangement is a defense against anxiety of what might be thrown up in the work. Yeah. We don't have to look at it. We don't have to supervise. Yeah. We don't. I remember when I was going around trying to interest people in the state to buy treatments and things. I went to one place and they said, "We don't have a problem. We don't have a drug or alcohol problem, so we don't need to buy treatment. We don't need to face up to it. We just said we don't have one." It's like Trump, isn't it? It's fantastic. Anyway, I said we'd come back to this. You'll see that we've switched them round. We've got the holding and containing environment on the right, and we've got the uncontained, fragmented, rampant addiction. Yeah? You have a point to make.
Yeah, you've got to occupy both places. Well, you've got to hold both places in mind. Yeah, because as a service provider, you have to hold both those things in mind, and the idea is that then your patient can learn to hold both things in mind, because otherwise they're going to be too vulnerable, you know.
Can I raise a point? June Lane occurred, you could say, because there was no water. There was no fresh water at all in London at that time. And so what alternative do they have? They drank gin and they drank beer. So without the basic sustenance of the normal expectation to be able to
I just want to come back how much I want to emphasize the point about countertransference. This is a quote, amalgamated evidence suggests that the therapist acting out of countertransference reactions is typically harmful to the patient. It's not equivocal. Therapist's sound management of these reactions typically enhances patient outcomes. And that, as I said, comes from the American Psychological Association's unbelievably rigorous review into what's effective in psychotherapy. So think about that, please, very, very carefully. We have some handouts. By the way, I think what we've been talking about effectively is something quite mundane in the usual conversations, and that is health and safety. Health and safety. Our health, their health and safety. Yeah? And as Kirby pointed out to me one time, really, recovery is all about health and safety.
Can I just say something before?
You please do.
In treatment now, I'm working in treatment for many, many years, and now, thank God, I'm not working on treatment, I'm working with families. But the thing is now is each worker have to have 15 clients or 60 clients. So I'm just sitting here and listening what you're saying about all these things, so I can't help but thinking about how this, you say health, safety, how is that work with 50 to 60 clients? You cannot hold anyone, don't know them, and they provide us with that, the commissioners want that. So I'm just wondering how unhealthy it is, how crazy that is.
In my view, what you described there is addiction has got the system by the throat.
Absolutely, but that's what's going to make my point, isn't it? It's about addictions as well, isn't it? So you give them a chance because they come for something, and that's what they get with addictions as well, isn't it? They don't get much.
If you think about what they're asking for,
Yeah.
is uncaring,
Yeah?
yes,
Absolutely.
no time,
Yeah.
that sort of thing on the right takes time,
That's what I'm saying. That's what
Yeah.
I'm saying. It's just a blink.
and they want a fix.
Yeah.
What is addiction based on?
Yeah.
The fix.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it absolutely colludes with addiction and you have to do everything you can, and I remember struggling to do that, to try to explain to them the contradiction of that. Yeah. And I empathize and sympathize with the situation. Not just for you, but for the people you're trying to help.
Absolutely. I just wanted to make the point because I saw these pictures, so remind me of exactly what they're going through and how they work with the clients. So
Yes.
it's quite helpful. Thank you.
I mean, time is such an important factor. If you think about the number of years that it's taken to develop some of these problems, and layers and layers and layers, to offer people very short amount is, to me, is part of the problem. It's not helping. Right, we have over there handouts, and we've put the equivalent signs of a healthy container and signs of an unhealthy container, and Kirby said you don't want to separate them, so we printed them awkwardly back to back. So you have to figure out how they fit together. It's a bit like a nice puzzle. We've also got the tale of two cultures, which is the culture of addiction and the culture of recovery. And you can, if you want, use these as a kind of checklist, a health checklist, if you want. Or you may just find them useful to, well, you can't use them as scrap paper, to stimulate thinking about this important subject. I hope we've given you some illumination into our thinking about the healthy container.
Thank you.